In 1994, a neighbor who had just, barred your sugar on a Tuesday could somehow be convinced to burn your house down on a Thursday.
Yeah, it's a horrifying reality.
It really is. And I guess the big question is, how does the human brain make that leap? So welcome to the deep dive. We are stepping into a custom-tailored discussion today, specifically designed for a high school civics class that's currently studying modern media literacy.
Right, and it's a vital topic for them.
Absolutely. So your mission today as listeners, and it is a heavy one, but it's totally essential for understanding the world you're about to inherit as voting citizens, is this. We are going to examine the anatomy of an enemy. We're going to look really closely at how political, religious, racial, and nationalist ideologies basically construct enemies using propaganda.
Exactly. And ultimately, we are investigating the hidden, psychological mechanisms that manipulate ordinary human beings into viewing the people living right next door as existential threats.
Right. It's a critical mission. And I think, especially for anyone studying civics in our current climate, we really have to start by defining our terms.
We do.
Yeah.
Because in political science, there's this fundamental difference between a political opponent and an ideological enemy.
Okay, so let's break that down. What's a political opponent?
So a political opponent is just someone you compete against within a shared democratic system. Like you might disagree with them vehemently on, say, tax policy.
Right, or how to fund education or zoning laws.
Exactly. But you recognize their fundamental legitimacy. You accept that they have a right to exist, a right to speak, and, a right to compete for power. You recognize them as a fellow citizen.
So it's kind of like two teams playing a sport. Like you desperately want to win, and you might even use some, aggressive strategies to win.
Sure.
But both teams agree on the fundamental rules of the game. And more importantly, both teams agree the other team is actually allowed to be on the field. You don't, try to ban the other team from the sport itself.
Precisely. You don't seek their total destruction, right? You just seek to outscore them. An ideological enemy, by contrast, is framed as an existential danger.
An existential danger. So the whole narrative shifts.
It shifts entirely.
Yeah.
It moves from this person has bad ideas that will cost us money to this person's very existence threatens the survival of our nation or our religion or our culture.
Wow. And I imagine the psychological shift that follows that reframing is pretty profound.
Oh, it is. Because once a group is categorized as an existential enemy, compromise suddenly becomes viewed as a moral failure.
Because you can't compromise with a lethal threat.
Exactly. If you're dealing with a threat to your sheer survival, negotiating with that threat makes you a traitor.
Right, yeah.
And that is the exact pivot point where repression or even physical violence becomes justified in the minds of the general public. It gets rebranded as mere self-defense.
It really reminds me of an autoimmune disease within a society.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, like when a human body has an autoimmune disorder, the defense mechanisms, the white blood cells, the immune system, they get completely confused.
Right.
They start attacking the body's own healthy tissue, absolutely convinced that this healthy tissue is a lethal pathogen. Like the immune system fully believes it's saving the body, but it's actually destroying it from the inside out.
Yes.
It seems like a society does the exact same thing with its institutions and its people.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the pathology of this breakdown.
Yeah.
The society is... it's turning its defensive energy inward against itself.
Right.
But it's crucial to recognize that this autoimmune response, it doesn't just happen overnight. You don't go from borrowing sugar to burning down houses in a single leap.
It takes time.
It does. It doesn't start with violence. It starts with identity. It starts with the architecture of us versus them.
Okay, I really want to explore that because identity usually feels like a positive thing, right? Like we all want to belong to a community or a nation, a graduating class, a club. We're social creatures.
Yeah.
So how does the desire to belong turn into the architecture of an enemy?
Well, belonging is a fundamental human need, yes. But collective identity rarely exists in a vacuum. What sociological research consistently shows is that collective identity fundamentally relies on excluding groups that are labeled as cultural threats.
So you need an outsider to have an insider.
Basically, ideologies don't just define what a community stands for, they define who gets to belong in the first place. The promise of unity or national renewal, it almost always comes with a strict, invisible boundary that keeps someone else out.
Wait, so who actually decides where that boundary is drawn? Because it seems like the definition of us changes depending on who's doing the talking.
Political movements and leaders do. They're the architects of those boundaries. Let's look at the research by Moritz J. Meigers on populist ideology, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
Populism is a political approach that relies heavily on dividing society into two distinct warring camps. You have a virtuous people and a corrupt elite. Now, on the surface, when a politician says the people, it sounds inclusive. It sounds like it means everyone. But crucially, the boundaries of the people are not neutral or objective. They're deliberate political creations.
So the people is actually a really loaded term.
Highly loaded. The term implicitly excludes minorities, immigrants, or political dissenters who just don't fit the leader's specific narrow definition of what is authentic or virtuous.
I see.
If you disagree with the populist leader, you're no longer part of the people. You're part of the corrupt elite, or you're an outsider.
It's like a shell game. Like the definition of the corrupt elite or the dangerous outsider just constantly shifts depending on whatever economic or social crisis a political leader needs a scapegoat for today.
Okay.
Like one day, the elite might be wealthy bankers. The next day, it might be university professors. Then it might be a specific ethnic minority or journalists. The target keeps moving, but the structure, the absolute necessity of having an enemy to point at, stays exactly the same.
That is precisely the mechanism. The identity of the enemy is interchangeable, but the function of the enemy is permanent. And we see this vividly when we look at how cultural and gender targets are utilized in modern politics.
Okay, how so?
Wasowski-Breckenmacher's research at the Carnegie Endowment highlights a very specific trend. She notes that authoritarian movements frequently use opposition to feminism and LGBTQ+ rights to define a cultural enemy.
Why those specific targets, though? Like, why not just stick to arguing about taxes or infrastructure?
Because taxes and infrastructure don't trigger a visceral, emotional threat response.
Ah, right.
Breckenmacher's research shows that this is a highly specific tactic designed to unite otherwise totally different, fracturing ideological groups by presenting social change as an existential danger to, traditional families, religious freedom, and national identity itself. Politicians could just bypass rational debate.
So instead of arguing about complex economic policies, which, let's be honest, can be boring or confusing for a lot of voters, you manufacture a moral panic. You make people feel like their children or their way of life is under immediate attack.
Precisely. Didem Ünal analyzed this exact phenomenon in the context of Turkey's 2023 elections. And her research is fascinating because it shows how economic issues were intentionally sidelined.
During a period of significant economic struggle in Turkey, right?
Yes, you would expect the election to be entirely about inflation and jobs. But Ünal shows how anti-LGBTI+ rhetoric was utilized by political leaders to generate profound moral panic.
Wow.
The political strategy was to frame sexual minorities and political opponents not as citizens with different values, but as internal enemies working to destroy the Turkish family.
Which completely shifts the conversation. I mean, if a voter is worried about the price of groceries, but a politician convinces them that their family's fundamental safety is at risk, the groceries suddenly don't matter as much.
Exactly. By doing this, the political leaders could present themselves as the indispensable protectors of the nation. It securitizes a cultural disagreement.
Securitizes.
Yeah. It takes a debate about social values, human rights, or cultural evolution, and treats it as a matter of national security. When you securitize an issue, you give yourself permission to use extreme measures to solve it.
This brings up a critical question, though. We're talking about rhetoric here. We're talking about political campaigns, speeches, election strategies.
Right.
But how do we get from a politician making a speech about cultural values to actual organized violence against citizens? How does that societal autoimmune disease progress from, a mild fever to full organ failure?
That progression is what we call the slippery slope of dehumanization. It's a gradual psychological evolution. It never begins with a call to violence because the public would reject that outright.
Right, that would be too shocking.
Exactly. It begins subtly, begins with jokes, insults, rumors, and discriminatory rules. These things slowly, methodically strip away the individual identity of the targeted group. Brené Brown, a researcher who studies empathy and vulnerability, she makes a crucial assertion here. She says dehumanizing always starts with language. It starts by reducing diverse, complex human beings into threatening singular categories.
So it's the difference between saying, my neighbor John, who I disagree with on tax policy, and saying, those people who are a plague on our country.
Yes, you remove the name, you remove the personal history, the context, the shared experiences you might have with that person, and you substitute a flat, monolithic label. And this progression isn't just theoretical, it's been mapped out meticulously.
By who?
A scholar named Gregory H. Stanton developed a framework called the 10 Stages of Genocide. It demonstrates how these seemingly harmless political boundaries harden into institutionalized mass violence.
I think for a high school civics class, we really need to walk through these stages. What are they?
So the stages are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial.
Okay, let's break that down, because just listing them doesn't really do justice to how insidious this is. Stage 1 is classification. That sounds like what we were just talking about, us versus them.
Exactly. Classification is the basic human tendency to divide the natural and social world into categories. German versus Jew, Hutu versus Tutsi. It's the primary method of dividing society. Bipolar societies that lack mixed categories are the most likely to have genocide.
Okay, and then stage 2 is symbolization.
Yes, symbolization is applying names or symbols to those classifications. Sometimes it's linguistic, like calling a group infidels or foreigners.
Right.
Sometimes it's physical, like the yellow star that Jewish people were forced to wear in Nazi Germany, or the blue scars forced upon people by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
And that physical symbol creates an immediate visual barrier. You stop seeing a person, you just see the symbol.
Exactly.
What about the third stage, discrimination?
Discrimination is when a dominant group uses law, custom, and political power to deny the rights of the targeted group. The targeted group is stripped of full civil rights. This is where the state gets involved. They might lose citizenship, the right to vote, or, the right to hold certain jobs.
So we are 3 stages in, and nobody has been physically harmed yet. The state is just rearranging the legal furniture to make one group inherently lesser. Then comes stage 4, dehumanization.
This is the turning point. Dehumanization is the prerequisite for the violence. It's when one group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases.
That is so dark.
It is. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder. If you believe someone is a literal rat or disease spreading through your neighborhood, killing them doesn't feel like murder. It feels like sanitation.
It feels like self-defense. The autoimmune disease kicks in.
Yes, exactly. And from there, it accelerates rapidly. Organization is when the state or militias actually organize the logistics of violence. Polarization is when extremists drive the groups further apart, often silencing or assassinating moderates who try to stop the process.
So they take out anyone trying to keep the peace.
Right. Then preparation involves drawing up death lists or planning the final logistics. Persecution is forcing people into ghettos or concentration camps. Extermination is the mass killing itself. And finally, denial, where the perpetrators try to cover up the evidence and deny they committed any crimes.
It is chilling to realize that dehumanization happens all the way back at step 4. It happens long before the actual violence begins. It lays the psychological groundwork.
Absolutely. And if we look at a historical case study, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda provides a harrowing, crystal-clear example of this progression. The United Nations Outreach Program documented the testimony of Germaine Tuisson Miller, who was a survivor of that genocide.
Oh, wow.
Her testimony highlights exactly what we are discussing. The extreme violence, where nearly 1 million people were killed in roughly 100 days, it didn't spontaneously erupt out of nowhere. It was preceded by years of psychological conditioning.
What did that conditioning actually look like on the ground?
It was schoolyard insults. It was neighborhood rumors designed to build distrust. And most powerfully, it was constant dehumanizing radio broadcasts. There was a radio station, RTLM, that acted as the primary mouthpiece for the extremist Hutu ideology.
And what were they broadcasting?
Day after day, they referred to the Tutsi people as cockroaches and snakes. They blamed them for the country's political and economic problems. They broadcast the names and addresses of moderate politicians and Tutsi citizens, urging listeners to clear the brush or do their work.
They used agricultural and pest control language. They didn't say murder your neighbors. They said clear the brush. The United Nations actually has an exhibit called From Words to Violence that analyzes this exact phenomenon. It proves that hate speech isn't just a byproduct of conflict. It provides the ideological justification for violence.
It does. It conditions the public.
Yeah.
It makes the unthinkable seem not just acceptable, but necessary.
Which leads me to a really poignant question, especially for the students listening to this right now. We all hear stereotypes, right? We all hear edgy jokes online or in the hallway. At what precise psychological moment does a stereotype stop being just ignorance and mutate into a political weapon that justifies removing someone's rights?
That is the essential question. The precise moment of mutation is when the stereotype is adopted by institutional power and broadcast systematically to explain a societal crisis.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
A stereotype becomes a weapon when a political leader, a media personality, or a government institution points to a complex problem like high inflation, a global pandemic, or a spike in crime, and uses that stereotype to say they are the reason you are suffering.
Right.
It stops being a bad joke and becomes a state-sponsored diagnosis of the nation's problems.
Right, because you cannot reach millions of people with a schoolyard insult. You can't organize a national movement based on a rumor in your neighborhood. You need a delivery system.
Exactly. Propaganda is that delivery system.
Yeah.
And its primary function is the radical simplification of conflict. Complex problems, like why a currency is losing value or why a war was lost, are very difficult to solve and even harder to explain.
Yeah, economics is hard.
Right. So propaganda reduces those complex problems into emotionally powerful, incredibly simple stories.
How does it actually do that, though? What are the tools? Because I think we often assume propaganda is just like a poster with a strong guy holding a flag, but it's way more sophisticated than that.
It utilizes very specific psychological mechanics. First, the endless repetition of emotionally charged labels. If you call a group invaders every single day on the evening news, the brain eventually associates that group with the threat of an invasion, regardless of the facts. Second, the selective presentation of facts, where you only show crimes committed by the targeted group and ignore everything else. Third, the reliance on historical myths, conjuring up a fake, glorified past that the targeted group supposedly ruined.
Right, the good old days narrative.
Exactly. And fourth, vivid images of invasion, disease, or contamination. Propaganda does not try to win a rational argument. It appeals directly to pre-existing prejudices, grievances, and fears.
So it bypasses the logical part of the brain entirely and goes straight to the amygdala, the fear center.
Completely. And the most durable, potent form of this is the conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories offer a master blueprint of hate. They construct a hidden, all-powerful enemy.
Right.
The most infamous historical example of this is the fabricated text called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
I want to spend some time on this because the history of this document is just mind-boggling to me.
It really is. The Protocols was a forgery created in Russia in the early 20th century. It falsely claimed to be the leaked minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to control the world through the manipulation of the economy, the media, and political institutions.
Right. It was designed to look like a smoking gun.
Exactly.
And what's wild to me is that this document was proven to be a complete fraud very early on. Like, journalists and historians demonstrated that large sections of it were plagiarized word for word from an older French political satire that had absolutely nothing to do with Jewish people.
Yes, the evidence was clear.
The evidence that it was fake was overwhelming and public. But it didn't matter, did it?
It did not matter at all.
Hold on.
The document spread globally. Henry Ford funded its publication in the United States. The Nazis used it as a central pillar of their ideology.
So why did it survive if it was so obviously fake?
It survived because it offered a master template. It gave extremists a single hidden enemy that could be blamed simultaneously for capitalism, for communism, for war, for economic crisis, and for cultural change.
But wait, wouldn't contradictory evidence destroy the theory? I mean, if someone proves the document is plagiarized, shouldn't the people who believed it just say, "Oh, my mistake, I was fooled"?
You're thinking rationally, but conspiracy theories operate on a closed loop of logic that is highly resistant to correction. In the mind of a conspiracy theorist, the fact that the document was exposed as a fake is just proof of how powerful the conspiracy is.
Oh, I see. So if you prove the document is fake, the conspiracy theorist just says, see, they control the media and the courts. They are so powerful they can fake the proof and force you to publish it.
Precisely. Any evidence against the conspiracy becomes evidence of the conspiracy. It is an impenetrable psychological fortress.
That is terrifying.
It is. And this historical blueprint of the hidden enemy is absolutely thriving on the modern digital battlefield. Daryl M. West, researching at the Brookings Institution, points out the profound impact of artificial intelligence and disinformation today.
And this is where media literacy becomes a matter of democratic survival for the students listening. We aren't just dealing with forged documents anymore.
Now, we are dealing with deepfakes. AI-generated audio and video can now create highly realistic, completely false evidence of a political opponent's criminality or corruption.
Wow.
Imagine a local election in your town, and 3 days before voting begins, a video drops showing a candidate accepting a bribe or saying something horrific. The video looks real, the audio sounds perfectly like them.
And by the time the experts prove it's a deepfake, the election's over. The damage is done, which is, terrifying. If you cannot trust your own eyes and ears, how do you know what is true?
It creates a crisis of reality. When citizens can no longer agree on a shared set of basic facts, democratic debate becomes impossible. And this disinformation circulates with unprecedented speed because of the way our digital platforms are designed.
Right, the algorithm.
Yes. Richard Fletcher's research examines how partisan echo chambers function. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, and outrage is the highest form of engagement. Therefore, the algorithms serve users information that confirms their existing negative biases about opposing groups.
So you only see the data that proves the enemy is exactly as bad as you thought they were. You never see the correction or the nuanced context or the moderate voices from the other side.
Exactly. It makes me think of an analogy.
I actually have one for this.
Oh, good.
It makes me think of holding a magnifying glass over dry leaves on a sunny day.
Okay.
The social media algorithms, they're the magnifying glass. They just take ordinary, scattered human biases, suspicions, mild prejudices, small misunderstandings that might just dissipate on their own in the natural world. And they focus them so intensely into a single, concentrated point that they create a fire of political polarization.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
The algorithm doesn't create the sun and it doesn't create the leaves, but it creates the exact conditions for the fire to ignite.
That is a very sharp way to frame it. The technology accelerates the psychology. It takes human flaws and mechanizes them. And to understand just how devastating that fire can be when it is fully unleashed by a state, we need to look back at the 20th century.
All right.
We need to do a comparative analysis of how totalitarian regimes constructed their enemies. Because what you find is that while their underlying ideologies differed wildly, the mechanisms they used to construct the enemy were chillingly identical.
So if propaganda is the delivery system, how does it actually successfully hijack a state? Because when you look at the 20th century, you see this exact same psychological blueprint applied by regimes that supposedly hated each other. Let's look at fascism first, specifically Nazi Germany.
In Nazi Germany, the entire state ideology was built around the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, which translates to the national community.
Oh.
This was an exclusively racially defined community. Approved Aryan Germans were promised belonging, economic benefits, and a sense of historical destiny. But the existence of this community fundamentally required the aggressive exclusion of anyone deemed incompatible.
So again, the architecture of us versus them.
Yes. The Nazis utilized the rhetoric we discussed earlier to depict Jewish people as biologically inferior, comparing them in films and posters to rats or disease.
Right.
Yet, paradoxically, the propaganda simultaneously blamed them for controlling global capitalism in New York and London while also orchestrating international communism in Moscow.
I have to push back on that because that is a total logical contradiction. I'm struggling to understand how any educated public falls for that.
It's hard to grasp rationally, yes.
Right. Like, how can propaganda successfully convince a public that an enemy is simultaneously a subhuman, weak parasite, but also an all-powerful mastermind controlling the entire globe from the shadows? It makes no sense.
It makes no logical sense, but it makes perfect psychological sense. A scholar named Hubert J.M. Hermans explores this deeply in his concept of rejecting bad via externalization.
Can you ground that for us? What does emotional externalization actually mean in this context?
Think of it like a high school student who completely fails a final exam. Instead of admitting they didn't study, they blame the teacher for being unfair, they blame the lighting in the room for giving them a headache, and they blame the textbook for being confusing.
Right, they externalize their failure.
Exactly. Moral dualism allows a society to do the exact same thing on a grand scale. It projects everything it fears onto one single external scapegoat.
So it's basically a catch-all for societal anxiety.
Exactly. If the German middle class feared the ruthless, volatile exploitation of global capitalism, the propaganda projected that fear onto the enemy. If the German upper class feared the revolutionary upheaval and property confiscation of communism, the propaganda projected that fear onto the exact same enemy. The enemy becomes a blank canvas for the nation's terrors. It bypasses logic and operates entirely on emotional externalization. And once that mechanism of externalization is institutionalized, the category of enemies of the state always expands.
It has to expand, doesn't it? Because the scapegoat never actually solves the underlying problem, so you always need more enemies.
It did in Germany. Bureaucratically, the definition of the enemy expanded rapidly to include Roma people, people with physical and mental disabilities, gay men, and political dissidents like communists and trade unionists.
So the net just keeps getting wider.
Yes, the ideological classification became the foundation for industrialized genocide. Now, if we shift our focus to communism, specifically Stalin's USSR during the Great Terror of the 1930s, the underlying ideology was the polar opposite of fascism. But the mechanism of enemy construction was identical.
How did Stalin define the enemy, if not by race?
The enemy was defined by class and political loyalty. The initial targets were the kulaks, relatively affluent peasants or landowners, and counter-revolutionaries. The state propaganda framed these groups as existential threats to the utopian project of the Soviet state. They were called wreckers and saboteurs.
But the mechanism of expansion was the same as we saw in Germany.
Yes. The system of political repression generated a constant, insatiable demand for new suspects to justify the state's totalitarian control. The definition continually expanded to consume devoted Communist Party members, high-ranking military officers, and millions of completely ordinary citizens.
Anyone could be a target.
Anyone. If a factory failed to meet its production quota, it wasn't because of poor management or unrealistic goals. It was because hidden Trotskyite saboteurs had infiltrated the factory. If the crops failed, it wasn't bad weather. It was agricultural terrorists. Neighbors turned in neighbors just to meet local arrest quotas, terrified that if they didn't find an enemy, they would be labeled the enemy themselves.
It's the autoimmune disease in overdrive. But we cannot ignore how this dynamic played out in democracies, too. It's easy to point at dictatorships, but democracies aren't immune to this psychology.
No, they are not. Contrast Stalin's terror with the American Red Scares during the Cold War. The United States, a constitutional democracy, constructed an internal enemy based on the fear of alleged communist infiltration.
Right.
This framework of the hidden enemy was utilized by government agencies to investigate and harass civil rights leaders, most notably Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Explain how that worked. How does a democracy justify wiretapping a civil rights leader?
By redefining democratic dissent as a national security threat. Demands for racial justice, desegregation, and equal rights, which are fundamental democratic principles, were reinterpreted by security agencies like the FBI as evidence of foreign communist ideological manipulation.
Ah, I see.
The logic was, America is fundamentally sound, therefore anyone trying to radically change it must be an agent of the enemy.
So even in a democracy with a constitution and a Bill of Rights, the state can look at its own citizens asking for their legal rights and say, you are an agent of the existential enemy, therefore your rights no longer apply.
Yes. And this dynamic of dehumanizing the other is deeply, inextricably tied to the history of colonialism and apartheid as well. The architecture of the enemy is often used to justify systemic theft and subjugation. Consider Paul A. Kramer's study of the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century.
What was the rhetoric there? Because America framed itself as an anti-colonial power, right?
They did. But when the United States decided to annex the Philippines, they faced fierce resistance from the Filipino people who wanted independence. To justify a brutal military conquest, U.S. military and political rhetoric aggressively portrayed Filipinos as savage, childlike, or biologically incapable of self-government.
Just completely stripping them of agency.
Yes. Political cartoons in American newspapers depicted Filipinos as unruly children needing a stern American teacher, or as wild animals. Why? To justify severe military violence, including waterboarding and burning villages, as a noble, reluctant, civilizing mission, you deliberately degrade the humanity of the population to justify subjugating them.
It is the only way a society that claims to value freedom can justify taking freedom away from someone else. You have to convince yourself, through propaganda, that they aren't fully human, so the rules of freedom don't apply to them.
Precisely. We see a similar, highly formalized construction in apartheid South Africa. The minority white government utilized a concept they called swart javar, which translates from Afrikaans to black danger.
How is that used to maintain power?
They framed the demographic reality of a black majority not as a political fact, but as a literal threat to the survival of Western civilization in Africa. Any black political participation was framed as dangerous. And they cleverly merged this racial fear with the geopolitical anxieties of the Cold War. The apartheid government consistently equated black liberation movements like the African National Congress with global communist expansion. They told their citizens and their Western allies, if we give them equal rights, the communists take over.
So they took the civil rights struggle and painted it with that exact same existential enemy brush to justify decades of brutal oppression. But there is a crucial distinction in how the opposition handled this, right? I want to make sure we cover this because it shows a way out of the cycle.
This is a vital lesson for our civic students. Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress faced the immense challenge of fighting a brutally oppressive, heavily armed system. But they made a very specific, incredibly disciplined strategic effort to define the apartheid system itself as the enemy, rather than defining white people collectively as the enemy.
That is profound, and it goes against every instinct of human tribalism.
It was a conscious philosophical choice to prevent their resistance to institutional oppression from devolving into a reciprocal racial war. They understood that if they used the same dehumanizing tactics as their oppressors, they would inherit a broken, blood-soaked country.
Right.
They fought the legal framework, they fought the unjust laws, but they consistently affirmed the shared humanity of the people living within that system. The Freedom Charter of the ANC explicitly stated that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white.
And that distinction is everything. It is the difference between seeking justice and seeking revenge. Justice targets systems and behaviors. Revenge targets categories of people.
Exactly.
Which brings us unavoidably to the present danger. We've been looking at a lot of history, but this architecture of the enemy is not just in the past. This is happening right now, in real time, with polarization and democratic backsliding.
It is happening globally. Scholars like Thomas Carruthers, Brendan Hartnett, and Milan W. Svolik have all researched democratic backsliding extensively.
So what does that term actually mean?
Democratic backsliding is the gradual decline in the quality of democracy, often driven by democratically elected leaders who slowly dismantle checks and balances. What their research finds is that extreme polarization tricks citizens into viewing ordinary elections as battles for national survival.
When democracy is on the ballot, basically.
Democracy fundamentally requires that you recognize your political opponents as legitimate. You have to accept that sometimes you lose elections, and when you lose, you hand over power peacefully, knowing you can try again next time.
Right.
But when an opposing party is repeatedly labeled as treasonous or criminal or a literal biological threat to the nation's survival, a dangerous psychological shift occurs in the electorate. Citizens become willing to accept the collapse of democratic rules.
Because they're scared.
Yes. They become willing to accept authoritarian leadership, political violence, and the rejection of legitimate election results, simply to keep the enemy out of power.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second. Think about how often you hear the phrase, if they win, our country is destroyed. Think about how common that specific rhetoric has become on cable news, on your social media feeds, and in political advertisements.
It's everywhere.
It really is. When every single election is framed as the final apocalyptic battle for survival, breaking the rules of democracy suddenly feels justified. It feels like a heroic act of self-defense. If the other side is truly evil, you aren't cheating, you're saving the world. That is how the psychology of democratic collapse works.
And we have contemporary case studies proving this is happening right now. A Carnegie Endowment report on divided Georgia by Arkell Gegeshides and Thomas DeWall shows how political actors in that country use accusations of treason and highly abusive rhetoric to deny their opponents any democratic legitimacy.
Wow, okay.
It turns political competition, which is supposed to be about policy, into a toxic, zero-sum struggle between so-called patriots and traitors. When that happens, the institutions of democracy, the courts, the electoral commissions, are no longer seen as neutral umpires. They are seen as weapons to be captured.
And we see it closer to home, too.
Yes. Rachel Kleinfeld's findings on the rise of political violence in the United States illustrate this clearly. Her research shows how elite rhetoric, the language used by politicians and media figures, along with the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, is directly driving public acceptance of harassment and violence against political rivals, election workers, and judges.
So it trickles down.
Exactly. When leaders legitimize the language of the enemy, the public eventually acts on it.
So we have mapped out the disease. We have looked at the autoimmune response tearing societies apart, from Rwanda to Nazi Germany to modern digital echo chambers. But we cannot leave a civics class without a cure.
No, we definitely can't.
If this is the mechanism of destruction, how do communities restore human connection across these incredibly deep ideological divides? How do we stop the societal autoimmune disease?
We have to focus on practical, citizen-level strategies. We cannot wait for politicians to change their rhetoric because polarization is often too profitable for them. The antidote to polarization begins with what legal scholar Andrew Clapham calls dehumanization.
Dehumanization, what does that actually look like in practice?
It is the deliberate, conscious practice of restoring personal histories, names, and moral complexity to targeted populations. It is recognizing that shared humanity does not mean ignoring real conflicts or pretending policy differences don't exist.
Right.
You can still vehemently disagree on immigration or taxes or healthcare. Dehumanization simply means resisting the claim that an opponent has no rights, no humanity, and no legitimate place in society.
I have to push back on this a little bit. That sounds great in theory, very noble. But if someone is actively campaigning on taking away my civil rights or calling me a traitor online, isn't it naive to just focus on restoring their moral complexity? How do you actually fight back without becoming what you hate?
It is incredibly difficult, but it is not naive. It is strategically necessary if you want to preserve a democracy. And there are political movements succeeding with this exact strategy.
Oh, really?
Yes. Gülsen Karabağ's research analyzed the pushback against populism in Turkey. The political opposition found success by flatly refusing to mirror the toxic, enemy-driven rhetoric of the ruling party. They realized that if they engaged in a mudslinging contest, they would only reinforce the idea that society was fundamentally at war.
So what did they do instead?
Instead, they ran a campaign based on a concept they called radical love. They focused on inclusion, optimism, and crucially shared municipal concerns.
Wait, municipal concerns,
Wait,
like
fine.
garbage collection and streetlights.
Yes, exactly that. Focusing on fixing local potholes, improving public parks, ensuring clean water, and fixing public transportation drains the power from polarizing rhetoric.
That is so interesting.
It grounds the political conversation in tangible, physical reality rather than abstract, cosmic, ideological battles. You might fiercely disagree with your neighbor on national identity or foreign policy, but everyone wants their trash picked up on time. Everyone wants their local park to be safe for their kids.
That makes total sense.
It forces people to interact as neighbors, navigating shared physical spaces, rather than as ideological avatars on the internet.
That is brilliant. It pulls you out of the algorithmic echo chamber and forces you back onto your actual street. It is very hard to view someone as an existential demon when you are both just trying to get the city council to fix a stop sign.
Exactly.
So for the next generation, for the students listening to this deep dive right now, what are the actionable steps for media literacy? How do they protect themselves from the architecture of the enemy?
There are 3 clear, actionable steps. First, fiercely support independent, transparent journalism. Propaganda thrives in the dark, where facts can be easily manipulated. Good journalism provides the context that breaks down simple, hateful narratives.
Right, demand the facts.
Second, demand accountability for digital manipulation. You must learn to identify deepfakes, verify sources, and actively question emotionally sensational claims. If a piece of media makes you feel immediately, violently enraged, stop and ask yourself, who benefits from me feeling this way right now?
That is a great rule of thumb. If it makes you furious, it is probably designed to bypass your logic.
Exactly. And third, perhaps most importantly, actively seek contact across ideological lines. The illusion of a homogenous evil outgroup shatters when you actually sit down and have a meaningful conversation with someone from that group. Psychological research on the contact hypothesis shows that interpersonal contact under conditions of equality is one of the most effective ways to reduce prejudice.
Because you cannot hate someone whose story you know. When you know about their kids, their struggles, their parents, the monolithic label falls apart.
Exactly. You must consciously work to preserve the individuality of people. Resist the urge to assign collective blame. When one person commits a crime, blame the person, not their entire demographic category.
So let's look at the vast journey we just took. We traced the anatomy of an enemy from a simple, casual, schoolyard insult to the dehumanizing language of radio propaganda, all the way to the systemic, violent machinery of totalitarian states.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We explored how the human mind can be tricked into externalizing its fears. And we brought it back down to the power of a single citizen standing in their local community.
The power to choose to view a political rival as a human being with legitimate rights, rather than a monster to be destroyed.
Yep.
It is a choice we have to make every single day.
To everyone listening, remember this. Preserving democracy requires disagreement. The goal of a free society is not a society without conflict. That is impossible. The goal is a culture that is capable of confronting injustice, debating policy, and fighting passionately for a better future, entirely without denying the humanity of its opponents.
Without that fundamental respect for shared humanity, without the commitment to dehumanization, the democratic system inevitably collapses into a primal war of survival.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends, as you go back to your day, your feeds, and your communities. Throughout human history, our strongest collective identities have almost always been forged by defining an outside enemy. We unite by finding someone to oppose. The tribe comes together when the predator is at the edge of the firelight. If we successfully eradicate this politics of enemies, if we truly learn the lessons of media literacy and empathy, can a truly globalized, interconnected human society sustain a unified identity without needing a shared external adversary? Or is the profound psychological need for an outgroup a ghost we will be wrestling with forever?